Okay, great. So welcome to our speakers and to our audience whenever you're watching this, to this recorded panel event, Time to Talk Climate, presenting the voices and perspectives of women from different faith traditions on environmentalism, and including those perspectives that are sometimes sidelined in conversations around climate action. I'm Maeve Carlin from the Women's Interfaith Network, a women's charity for all faiths and none, with grassroots groups across London and the South East. With the UN's upcoming conference on climate change, COP26, just around the corner, and 23 national governments declaring a global climate emergency, now is a critical time to talk about climate action and environmentalism. As women have been found to be particularly at risk from climate change around the world, the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change has called for gender-responsive policy with women's input across the board. The WHO note that women's involvement leads to better risk management and reduction in environmental disasters, as well as to more effective relief programs. However, women are still underrepresented at the highest levels of government and in decision-making roles, making up only 30% of scientific bodies worldwide. On the other hand, studies show that concern for the environment is seen as intrinsically feminine, so that sustainability becomes another form of women's labour, leading marketing firm Mintel to coin the term the eco-gender gap. Given the disproportionate impact of the climate crisis on women and the risk of their being sidelined at the high levels of environmental policy making, there is a real need to amplify women's voices in this global conversation. Also, notwithstanding the long and rich traditions of stewardship and respect for the earth as divine creation in many faiths, faith groups and their leaders are becoming increasingly visible in environmental circles. As religious believers often see themselves as part of a global community of faithful, they may feel intimate ties to communities already facing the brunt of climate change overseas. It's important, therefore, to ask how women from different traditions, particularly those outside the larger faiths, understand our relationship and responsibilities to the world around us and to each other. With organisations like the UN appealing to religious groups to mobilise faith for environmental reform, it's also critical to look at how religious and secular perspectives can work together for climate action and how women can be part of making this happen. Here at WIN, we're passionate about promoting friendship and dialogue between women across religious and cultural lines, and we're thrilled to be hosting this conversation today. I'll now introduce our wonderful speakers, the first of whom was unable to be with us at the time of recording, so has kindly pre-recorded some comments for us. Dr. Jagbir Jhutti-Johal is a reader in Sikh studies at the Department of Theology and Religion, University of Birmingham. She has over 20 years' experience in teaching and research, and extensive knowledge and experience of Sikh theology, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues facing the Sikh community. Her research covers issues of gender equality, Sikh identity in the diasporic community, racialization and mistaken identity, and other contested issues that confront the Sikh community nationally and globally. Her work in the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion looks at public policy and social and political engagement issues impacting the British Sikh community. Dr. Jhutti-Johal is a steering group member on the UK Freedom of Religion or Belief Forum and has presented to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom on the Sikh and Hindu religious minorities in Afghanistan. She is also a presenter on BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day and a board member and trustee on a number of organisations, including Faith for the Climate. I'm now going to introduce the first of our speakers here live with us now, Prudence Jones. Prudence Jones is a former president from 1979 to 1991 and current interfaith liaison officer of the Pagan Federation, Europe's oldest pagan organisation founded in 1971. She is also the author of A History of Pagan Europe with Nigel Pennick, described as the first comprehensive study of its kind, exploring pagan traditions as a persistent force in European history, as well as authoring other publications on pagan spirituality. She represents paganism on the Cambridge University Multi-Faith and Spirituality Forum and has previously chaired the East of England Faith Agency and been a member of the National Council for Faiths and Beliefs in Further Education. Our next live speaker is environmentalist Zarina Ahmad, who has been working in the environmental sector for over 10 years. Zarina's aim has been to change the landscape of the environmental sector to ensure there is more engagement and a platform to amplify the voices from the ethnic minority sector. She has previously managed a Climate Challenge funded project, which led to working in partnership with Keep Scotland Beautiful, developing over 150 EM Climate Challenge funded projects across Scotland. Zarina has built valuable relationships with mainstream NGOs, as well as setting up the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network, a platform for EM voices and a network for emerging climate leaders. Zarina was named as one of the top 30 influential women in environment by BBC Women's Hour and is currently studying for a PhD on sustainability at University of Manchester. More recently, Zarina was recognised by Edinburgh Science Institute as an inspirational woman who has made a significant impact in STEM. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Lovely to be here.
We're going to kick off today with Dr. Jhutti-Johal's pre-recorded contributions before we hand over to our live speakers.
Lord Stern, the climate economist, said this is a crucial moment in history. Either we recover from the pandemic in a strong and sustainable way, or we do not. We are at a real fork in the road. This decade is decisive. Sir David Attenborough also noted that staying below 1.5 degrees is the only chance we have of avoiding these tipping points and stabilising our world again. As a Sikh, I am very conscious of how Punjab has been affected by climate change. Failure of the Green Revolution and the negative impact that this has had on the land of Punjab is clear. The Green Revolution focused on Punjab becoming the source of a lot of the food for India, but for this there was a need for intensive farming, which required the use of fertiliser, pesticides, farm machinery and irrigation. But this resulted in declining yields because the soil lost a lot of its main nutrients and the water table declined. The decline also resulted in a decline in income, which had a devastating impact on fellow Sikhs, such as increasing farmer suicides due to debt and poor crops, and this in turn had a gendered impact. Punjab has also shown me that we cannot assume that environmental change affects everyone similarly, or even that it affects the marginalised in similar ways. We have to recognise the difference and how it does often serve to make women and young people more vulnerable, and that they have unique experiences as environmental refugees or due to food insecurity. Faith communities globally, but also nationally in the UK, have already recognised the seriousness of the situation and taken the responsibility, and one could argue a religious duty, to play a role in protecting the future ecology of the planet. Faith communities have within their religious teachings instructions to do what they can to ensure they are environmentally responsible, and this is true for the Sikh community. Sikhs can draw on the life of the seventh Guru, Guru Har Rai, who is revered for his sensitivity to the natural world, and verses from our eternal Guru, the Guru Granth Sahib, the Holy Scripture, to guide us on how to live in harmony with the environment. Scripture teaches us that God is dwelling in all his creation. Every creature in this world, every plant, every form is created by the Creator and is a manifestation of the Creator. You yourself are the bumblebee, the flower, the fruit, and the tree. You yourself are the water, the desert, the ocean, and the pool. You yourself are the great fish, the tortoise. Guru Nanak said, "Air is the Guru, water is the father, and earth is the great mother of all." The importance of air, water, and earth to life are emphasized over and over again in the Guru Granth Sahib. The earth is referred to as the mother, and as such requires our respect, gratitude, and ethical conduct, because like a parent, it selflessly and lovingly nurtures and sustains us. Great care needs to be taken to ensure that no damage occurs to it while we as Sikhs go about our daily life. The pollution of these three elements goes against the principles laid down by the Gurus, because air, water, earth and sky, the Lord has made these his home and temple. It is only by living in harmony with nature and water, air, land, forests and biodiversity will remain vibrant living systems for our future generations and for our generation as well. Sikh scripture also teaches us to revere the earth as a dharamsal, a sacred place established by the Lord to practice dharma and rightful living. In the midst of these, he established the earth as a home for dharma. This also reminds Sikhs that we are stewards or custodians who have a shared moral and ethical responsibility to safeguard and protect all life, sarbat da pala, and live in harmony with nature because human and environmental health are mutually dependent. Sikhs, since the time of the Gurus, have engaged in social justice and civic action. The activism is inspired by the values and ideals of seva, selfless service, and sarbat da pala, welfare of all, which, whilst always taken to imply work towards the collective good of humanity, is now also linked to the environment, so that we provide service to nature. Sikh environmental engagement also reminds Sikhs of the concept of Miri Piri, which refers to the spiritual and temporal domain and instructs followers to embody both for the collective good of the environment. The following are some key activists within Sikh environmental protection campaigns. Bhagat Puran Singh is known for his charity Pingalwara, which focuses on caring for the poor and for individuals with physical and mental disabilities. But he also had a strong environmental agenda and has become known for his activism around tree planting and for voicing his concern around soil degradation and erosion. Pingalwara itself has become something of a model for sustainable living. The Pingalwara farm practices what the organisation calls natural farming. The farm produces all of its own fertiliser from mixtures of cow dung and urine, and plants are grown on the property. One of the highest profile Sikhs working on environmental issues is Sant Balbir Singh Jhutti-Johal of the Nirmala sect. Sant Balbir Singh is best known for his work in cleaning up the Carlin River. Guru Nanak is believed by Sikhs to have disappeared for 3 days while bathing in the Carlin River. His disappearance is understood as a transformative experience, as he is said to have ascended to the divine court. Upon reappearing, Guru Nanak began spreading his religious teachings. Thus, in some sense, the Carlin River is the site of the foundation of the Sikh tradition. Sant Balbir Singh has also worked with the global community in the fight to eliminate extreme poverty and gender inequality and address environmental issues. Other than being known as the Eco Baba, Time magazine crowned Sant Balbir Singh as a hero of the environment, claiming him as the only Indian and the only Asian to get this honour. Trees within the Sikh tradition are very important, and they have a sanctity in the Sikh tradition. There are 2 sacred trees, berry, associated with Sikh shrines. One, Dukpanjani berry at the Golden Temple or Sri Harmandir Sahib, and Gurdwara Bear Sahib of Sultanpur Lodi. I mention these trees because I want to make reference now to the organisation called EcoSeek, which has been engaged in tree planting initiatives across the world. For the 550th birth anniversary of Guru Nanak, EcoSeek has been involved in a global project of planting 1 million trees. In 2019, in the UK, the Sikh community planted trees in Coventry, Manchester, Ipswich, Peterborough and Leeds. Since 2013, Eco Amritsar, an offshoot of EcoSeek, has been arranging green Nagar Kirtans. A Nagar Kirtan is a procession around a town, Nagar, with Sikhs following the Guru Granth Sahib and singing hymns. The green Nagar Kirtans require cleaning up litter and using and collecting biodegradable plates made from dry leaves and serving organic food for langar. EcoSeek has also been working globally in making Gurdwaras environmentally friendly in their attempt to address environmental but also social justice, health inequality and food insecurity issues. Whilst most of the key figures that are visible on the activism trail are men, women, especially young women and young people in general, are working behind the scenes to address issues within homes and places of worship. One key female figure that stands out for me is Bandana Kaur, who became EcoSeek's North American Program Manager in 2010 after earning a master's degree in environmental science from Yale University. Bandana and her team are inspiring Sikhs to take on the challenges of climate change, sustainable urban planning, and repairing Punjab's depleted resources. Another organisation that is important to note is Karma Grow. This is a Canadian-based organisation focused on building community gardens to provide food banks with a sustainable source of fresh vegetables and to promote the Sikh principles of Sarbat da Pala, the well-being of all, and Seva, selfless service. Karma Grow works with various stakeholders to develop and maintain community gardens for the good of partner food banks. In conclusion, as Sikhs, we are to revere the earth as a dharamsala, a sacred place established by the Lord to practice dharma and rightful living. Sikhs believe that an awareness of that sacred relationship between humans and the environment is necessary for the health of our planet and for our survival. A new environmental ethic dedicated to conservation and wise use of resources provided by a bountiful nature can only arise from an honest understanding of our relationship with one another and nature. To achieve this, we all need to work together. We cannot discuss the climate crisis in our own secular or religious silos. All people, whether of faith or none, need to come together because this is an issue that affects everyone and does not discriminate. Dialogue and joined-up activism on the environment will teach and reveal how we have more in common in our teachings than that what divides us, particularly on the environment. Thank you.
Our thanks to Dr. Jhutti-Johal for those insights and really powerful stories of environmental activism from the Sikh community, which I'm sure we'll come back to in our discussion. I'm now going to hand over to the first of our wonderful live speakers, Prudence Jones.
Hello, well, thank you for having me and for grounding paganism. We always claim we were the first environmental religion. So let me explain what I mean by paganism. Some people might say, what? You call yourselves pagans? What's this about? Well, what we now call paganism is a religious outlook which venerates the natural world, seeing it as the expression of the indwelling divinity. Nature is sacred for us, and we recognize many divine beings, that is both goddesses and gods. We are, to put it briefly, nature venerating and polytheistic. But paganism, in this broad definition, ranges from simple animism, as with the people and nomadic peoples, very often who experience spirits in all parts of the natural world, from simple animism to complicated pantheons such as those of Greece and Rome. And indeed, I'm always very happy to link hands with my fellow polytheists in Hinduism and Shinto. Since these other faiths, which actually fall under this broad definition, usually have their own names and a quite distinct form and history, of course, as Shinto and Hinduism and other such faiths. Paganism today then is mainly understood as the indigenous tradition of Europe, and that's what I'll be speaking about now. It was revived in a suitable modern form from about the 18th century onwards. Okay, so we see the earth and nature as sacred. For us, it's the external expression of the invisible inner divinity which shapes us all, shapes the whole world. The 18th century thinker Spinoza spoke about God or nature, and he distinguished between nature and natured, that is the actual natural things around us, plants, animals, and us, and nature naturing, that is the force which shapes them into the form they have, which causes an acorn to grow into an oak and not into a beech tree. So this idea of us being part of nature, part of the natural world, but a particular type of natural being, is really at the root of our understanding of ourselves as pagans. And since human nature is part of nature around us, and part of our human nature is to be rational as well, rationality is part of human nature, the greatest virtue, the greatest expression of human beings could be seen as that of living intelligently in accordance with nature. So that's our little catchphrase. We seek to live intelligently in accordance with nature. And I can quote you any number of ancient philosophers who would back me up on this. So our rituals nowadays remind us of how we are part of a greater whole, and our life is part of a greater life. And pagans then like to live in accordance with the cycle of the seasons and the spirit of place. Now, the cycle of the seasons is interesting because we're recording this discussion in anticipation, well, as part of the COP meeting at the beginning of December, and this beginning of November rather. And this beginning of November time is a very important time in the traditional round in Northern Europe. The climate here means that it's around this time when we see summer ending, things dying, ailing animals which can't survive the winter would have had to be culled at one point. Harvests were brought in, and people had to look ahead to the certainty of cold and misery in the winter and make sensible preparations for it. So it was a very important time of year. It was the start of the Anglo-Saxon economic year, and into the 20th century, land rents were renewed at this time of year. Way back, the pagan kings of Ireland, the Celtic kings of Ireland, actually had a great feast at this time of year, and they would call their druids to forecast the coming year, the fortunes for the coming year. Well, nowadays we have the statistical people to do it, which is a bit more, a bit less flamboyant. But there is that sense of needing to look ahead and plan by whatever means and prepare for the darkness and the end of life. And it's interesting that at this time of year, we have a series of traditional festivals, some of which are based on calendar dates, but which have sort of remained to, I think coincidentally, perhaps because they appeal to human nature, to have a celebration at this time of year. So there's Halloween to guard against the spooks, All Saints to guard against the spooks with defenders, All Souls to commune with the ancestors, and those two are Christianity, but in paganism, again, we do contact our ancestors in our minds at this time of year. There's Guy Fawkes, which is a calendar date, but it's interesting that this festival has remained as a great bonfire celebration at this time of year. There is Remembrance Sunday on the 11th. Again, calendar date, but has remained. And then in Roman Catholic lands, there's Martinmas, the last of these, which is a sort of equivalent of Guy Fawkes, not a political one, but a Saint's Day, which again celebrates the beginning of winter and the opening of the new wine. So the boozers like that one. So here we are at a very significant season of the year, and just to turn our minds to it, I'll read you an invocation that we do at this time of year, showing that out of death comes new life in the cycle of the seasons. It's not our own new life every time, but it is, but things that die go into the greater whole, and out of them new life can come. Farewell, O sun, the ever-returning light, the hidden God who ever yet remains, who now departs to the land of youth through the gates of death, to dwell enthroned, the judge of gods and men, the horned leader of the hosts of air. Yet ever as he stands unseen about the circle, so dwelleth he within the secret seed, the seed of new root grain, the seed of flesh, hidden in earth, the marvelous seed of the stars. In him is life, and life is the light of man, that which was never born and never dies. Therefore his people weep not, but rejoice. So this is goodbye to the light, and yet knowing that later something will grow out of this death. Spirit of place, we are quite connected with particular places. There's a very strong sense of the tradition of any place. And in the ancient world, of course, you would have a goddess or a god associated with this place. So for example, at the volcanic crater, circular crater at Aricia, south of Rome, in which the full moon was reflected in this circular lake every month. The goddess Diana, in her aspect as a moon goddess, had a temple very much embodying that spirit, and hence able to direct people's minds, if you like, to the larger cosmos in which we're part. Again, seeing the moon, recognizing the goddess, and understanding something larger, our connection. We never forget our connection with the greater whole. But of course, nowadays we simply have folklore names such as Old Father Thames embodying the river, or the goddess Sabrina for the Severn. Where I live in Cambridge, just south of Cambridge, there's a huge hill fort, an Iron Age hill fort, guarding the road into the city from the south. And traditionally that was guarded by two mythical giants called Gog and Magog. So the folklore imagination brought this up even when paganism had disappeared. And at my other hill fort, Worlbury Hill on the Somerset coast, the fishermen used to throw a little pebble onto a pile of pebbles, a cairn of pebbles, and call on the spirit of the place, saying, Pick Winard, bring me a good dinner, the fish. So there's this sense of our place, and in paganism we recognize this and we'll try to incorporate that in our rituals when we can. I have a nice one from Cato, the Roman. He was a bit of a stick in the mud, an old Roman stick in the mud, about 120 BCE, telling people how to do traditional rituals and get them right, young people. He was he said, look, when you're clearing a wood, there are various of these, but clearing a wood, you might not know what the spirit of the place is. However, if you invoke thus, whether god or goddess to whom this wood is sacred, you will do okay. And, or at least they will let you know if your clearing of trees is not in their favor. There will be coincidental accidents, there will be omens of one sort or another, and then you'll have to go and get it right the next time. So it's there's a strong tradition of being not just following your own impulses, your own aims, what you want to impose on life, but understanding that that has to fit in with the larger process around in which we're part. And pagans, the second thing I want to say, the other thing, the main thing, is that pagans, as I mentioned, venerate both goddesses and gods. And these are seen as equal in power and dignity. So for us, women too are made in the image of the divine. And the goddess principle, which is often seen as an inclusiveness, process, what is going on, what is unfolding, assimilation, incorporation, is in a constant dynamic balance with the God principle of focus, directedness, and differentiation. And neither of these is supreme. You have the two in a kind of Taoist dance of complementary opposites. We have both in us, and at a certain time, one will be favored above the other. And for us, the earth and nature are generally seen as goddesses to be honored as such. I'll just give you a later invocation, which is based in fact on a herbalist's spell from the 12th century, but it's actually based on this one is actually based on a more ancient invocation of the moon goddess from, again, the 2nd century Common Era of the Romans. This is one for the earth then. Divine goddess earth, mother of nature, who generates all things and brings forth ever anew the sun, which you alone show to all folk upon the earth. O guardian of heaven and sea and arbiter of all the gods, by whose influence nature is wrapped in silence and slumber, you are she who restores day and puts the darkness to flight, who governs the shades of night in all security, restraining at your will the mighty chaos, winds and rains and storms, or again, letting them loose. You churn the deep to foam and put the sun to flight and arouse the tempests, or again, at your pleasure, you send forth the glad daylight. You provide us with food in safety by a perpetual covenant, and when our soul passes away, it is in your bosom that we find our haven of rest. You're called by the loving kindness of the gods, the great mother, who has conquered the god. Oh, you don't need to hear that bit. The great mother, you are, there's some politics in this. You are the strength of nations and the mother of the gods, without whom nothing can be born or come to maturity. Mighty art thou, queen of the gods, thee we adore in thy godhead. So there, again, recognizing the power of nature. And again, I suppose as a modern pagan, I would say, however much we realize that we can tip the balance of nature and arouse all kinds of storms and droughts and extreme weather conditions, the actual power that we unleash is greater than we are. You can't stand up against a hurricane or a tidal wave. So we need to be careful and to keep that balance in mind. We are interacting with a much larger force. I mentioned my interfaith prayer. Would that be suitable here? Yes, to end with. This again is a goddess prayer, but I should say pagans absolutely respect the god and the male principle, but because we're talking about women and the earth, I'm doing the goddess. So, interfaith prayer. May the great goddess watch over all peoples and bring them to the flowering of their fulfillment. May she nourish and protect them who are all unknowing her children. May she bring to them the knowledge of their fellowship within her hall, in which all races live, of their companionship at her table, from which all nations eat. May all the men and women of earth take up the stewardship of their inheritance. May joy and fulfillment come to those who care for this bright globe. May understanding come to those who labor unawares. Let the grace of the goddess be born within us all, the children of earth and heaven. Let the knowledge of her fellowship guide our actions and our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prudence. That was wonderful. And I find it so moving, that idea of people thinking of the seed of the new year and, you know, looking with hope to the coming of the light. And I think maybe there's something in that for us at this time of sort of environmental crisis. How can we kind of find hope and find that seed to come back to a better relationship with nature?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
So,
we mourn that which is gone, but nourish that which is to come. Yes,
wonderful. So before we dive into questions, because I've got loads, I'll pass the mic on to our next speaker, Zarina. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for having me on. So I'm probably coming in from this in a different perspective, really talking about a little bit about my journey and how it's linked to religion and how religion has influenced a lot of the work that I do. And some of the learning, I'd like to bring in some of the learning as well. So my journey started because of a couple of incidents, a couple of racist incidents that happened, which challenged my thinking and my perception of the environmental sector. And I looked around and thought, oh my God, we live in this very white middle class sector, which is the environmental sector, which is where I was working at the time. And that led to me then going and approaching Scottish Government and asking them about the Climate Challenge Fund. So the Climate Challenge Fund is a community fund that the government give out to communities to take action on climate change. When I say communities, that covers different kinds of communities, from sports groups, from scouts, from faith groups, from bowling clubs to just local women's groups. Right. So at that point, so this is going back to 2012, between 2008 and 2012, the fund had already been live and kicking. And at that point, there was only 3 groups that had applied successfully for the Climate Challenge Fund. And one of them was a pilot project. And Scottish Government and other think tanks' perception was that ethnic minorities aren't interested in climate change because the fund's been out there, but it's just been a very low uptake, right? Now, for me, that didn't sit right. There was something about that that didn't resonate with my own experience. And I was like thinking, well, surely I can't be the only person of colour in Scotland that's interested in climate change, right? It just, you know, it just isn't the case. So the next question was, well, how do you know, right? And Scottish Government had just made an assumption. There was nothing, there was no basis on this perception. So we did a bit of work, and by that we had a conference. We invited a number of ethnic minority community organisations to come along. And what we learned from that was that they weren't aware of the funding. And if they had been, they may have applied for the funding and may have taken action on climate change. So that led to my work. So working with Scottish Government, Keep Scotland Beautiful and Assemble Scotland, in partnership with all of these, to do something that was going to be really difficult. This was going to be a hard sell job because I was working with communities that were hard to reach, that were marginalized, that had other priorities, that weren't engaging on climate change, right? It was the easiest job I ever had, right? And the easiest job I ever had for 2 reasons. The first was most of these communities that I worked with had connections to other parts of the world where climate change wasn't an abstract subject. It was real. The impacts of climate change were real. It was urgent. It was devastation. It was having a huge impact on their homelands and their families. So examples of that were like places that were having huge droughts, heat waves, glaciers melting. And when I say glaciers melting, what the impact of that would be like if your village was lying on the hills of the Himalayas, it meant when a glacier melted, it just totally devastated the whole village. So people had nowhere to go. They had no home, no alternative home. People's lives were lost. And again, with the drought, it's not just that you get bans on using your sprinkler or not being allowed to, wash your car. It meant that there was no food grown, and when there was no food grown, people starved. So there was this huge understanding. There was this huge understanding of what climate devastation was. So that was an easy topic to then talk about because people understood it. And the second inroad was actually religion and faith. So most of the communities I worked with were communities of interest and not geographical communities. So usually when funders or government define communities, they define them in terms of being in a geographical area. However, the communities I worked with came together not because they lived in a certain area, but because they had something of interest and commonality with each other. So whether that was culture, language, or their religion. And even in those communities that came together around culture or language, or if they were a women's group, they still had that commonality of religion. Right? And then, so religion was something that I learned, and I'm talking about lots of different religions here, that I learned to look at the text, look at the words, look at the examples, look at the ethos of religion, to see what the connections were with looking after the environment. So, and I suppose that came a little bit from my own upbringing. So I'm Muslim by background, and as I grew up as a child, I was always very environmental, very environmentally conscious. But however, a part of that environmental consciousness was that I was a vegetarian stroke vegan from a very, very young age, and I did not want to eat meat, and I refused to eat meat. But my family, who were from a Muslim background, actually used to laugh at me and say, "You were born in the wrong family, you were born in the wrong religion, you should have been a Jain," right? So a Jain it's not a sect of Hinduism, it's a religion on its own, but it's very much it advocates for not eating meat, not killing anything. So, so for me, and as a child, this was something that I held very closely and dearly as part of my values. But as I grew up, I learned more and more about Islam, and I learned that actually a lot of things are misinterpreted. I don't want to say misinterpreted, or subject to interpretation, right? I mean, I'm going to be biased and say it's misinterpreted, but yes, subject to interpretation is probably a better way. And again, with other religions, I found very similar attitudes, right, with religious texts, that actually, if you look for pro-environmental ethics, sayings, ways of being, they're there in many of the religions. When I talk about the religions that I've worked with, the religious groups that I've worked with include Muslim groups, Christian groups, pagans, Bahaism, Judaism, Jainism, Sikhism, Hinduism, humanists. So a number of religions. Within those religions, there is a lot to be said about environment and about looking after the environment, just like you were saying earlier on, Maeve, about the stewardship of the land. But there's also like practical examples as well about planting seeds and the importance of planting seeds and trees for shelter, for water, for the sustaining life beyond us humans as well. Part of being the one ecosystem, we belong, we don't dominate the earth. However, what's happened over the years is actually patriarchism. So this male dominance has come in to religion and also into politics and the world that we have at the moment, where it's become much more about dominance, about exploitation, about extraction. And this is the thing that I think that we can, as women, we bring a different angle, we bring a different viewpoint, we bring a different perspective. And that's because of the way we might interpret different readings, different elements and different parts of religion, or different even parts of different policy. And it all comes back to our own frames of references, the world views that we hold and we value are different from men. And then on a practical example of some of the work with religious groups, what I found was the role of women. So the women were at the forefront of actually making changes. They were at the forefront of actually taking action. They were at the forefront of resilience, coming up with solutions. Yet they were at the back when it came to representation. Right. And when I say representation, especially at political level, and we're seeing this now at COP, and I get really frustrated at COP because you've got the blue zone where the UN delegations are, where the policymakers are. And all I hear from men is, how do I get in there? I want to be there. And I don't hear this from the women. It's all mostly for men that want to be in these spaces because they feel that these spaces give them power. But yet, as women, we know that those spaces aren't going to actually make the changes that we need to make. So which is really interesting, because more, from the work that I see is that women are the change makers. Even men look to women for the change makers. And then even if you look in some of the texts on religious texts, and they talk about the role of the mother in terms of education and changing and nurturing, all of these things, right? But yet we aren't given our place in society. So that's the bit I'm really interested in, is like making sure that women place in society is recognized, within religion is recognized, and is given the power to do what they're good at.
Thank you so much, Zarina. I really, oh, am I still muted? No. Thank you so much. I think what you said about our frames of references is so interesting. What do we bring that's unique and different to this conversation? And yet, if we have, you know, something really important to offer, why are we not in the room, or why are we not in the right room at the right time, or seen to be in the room? Really interesting. So thank you both so much for sharing your perspectives on these issues at such a critical moment for climate action and environmentalism. I'll now move into some questions for both of you. So what do you think, Zarina, let's start with you. What do you think that mainstream climate discourse could learn from perhaps a feminist lens, or from women in faith communities?
So I think it's about two things. One is, like you said, is like the perspective that women bring, right? So that bring in more of the nurturing perspective, and not underplaying playing it as a weakness, which is often the way it's seen, that, you know, holding emotion or being caring somehow is a weak trait. But yet we've seen some of the world leaders, when they show these traits, they actually bring people along with them. So people like Jacinta Ardern from New Zealand, you know, she's been showing these at even Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. She shows some of these compassionate traits. And I think that's something that we've got to bring into some of that discourse, because it's important. So even looking at the care sector, thinking about like caring as a role of what women really, you know, are at the front of, that caring is part of nurturing, and recognizing and valuing that, because without that, we don't actually have a society. So, and again, with religion, therefore, you know, religion is based upon that, based upon like caring for each other, caring for the environment, caring for our community, caring for, you know, our communities. So we undervalue care. So I think the discourse needs to bring in care, where at the moment the discourse is very much around economic growth, right? So I think, and I know that people think we can't equate the two, but yet we can equate the two, because we don't value care. We don't value it in terms of a financial or a monetary way, where we should be. You know, if we want to talk financial models, then maybe we should be putting care into that financial model. That's one way. The second is, and this is quite relevant to BME communities. So what isn't brought into is like different perspectives from different communities that are impacted differently, right? And it's usually done on a very one-sided view, right? So it's usually by the majority. However, when we think about the minority, the ethnic minority within the UK, the minority maybe in the UK, but the global majority, right? And I think that should change, because as soon as you say that a group of people in society are a minority, we're treating them already as if they're undervalued, they're not important, they're second class. So I think we need to change that, but there's a lot of learning that we could also take from people from different parts of the world. And I think it's that valuing the learning that we can bring. So valuing existing behaviors that people have, valuing different perspectives that people have, and being more open to hearing different viewpoints. Because I think with that, we have the richness to change, opportunities to change, and we can bring in more resilience to change, not to change, but to make an impact.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that idea of shifting the lens to compassion and actually amplifying the voices of the global majority is really important. Prudence, could I ask you sort of the same question? What do you think mainstream climate discourse could learn perhaps from a pagan perspective?
there's so much discussion about caring for the environment, stewardship of the environment, and damage to the environment, which are a valid way of looking at it. But our way of looking at it is that we are part of the environment, and we're damaging part of ourselves in the greater self. This will come back and bite us. If we pollute our rivers, then it'll take a few years, but crops won't grow, toddlers will die of typhus, and so on and so on and so on. So there's this idea that we have to work in harmony always, we as the little people almost, with an enormous, as if we're living with an elephant in our back garden, and you annoy an elephant and you are in trouble. It might seem very cuddly at the moment. You might think you're in charge. You can do an awful lot of things to an elephant with your science and technology, but just get it wrong ever so slightly and you're squashed. And I think that's what's happening. Perhaps that's a bad example because I'm talking about two beings, but I'm seeing the natural world outside as something so enormous that it will just flatten us. And so our little part of nature has an immediate impact on the greater nature all around us, and we better make sure that we're in a harmonious relationship with it.
Yeah, that idea that the human interest and the best interests of the planet are not remotely separate, but
that's right. That's right.
Thank you. So picking up on something that was in Dr. Jhutti-Johal's presentation, actually, she talked about how acts of worship can become sort of integrated with environmental activism, where they sort of become one and the same. Is that something that you experience in pagan traditions, Prudence?
Yes, absolutely. For a long time, when the Pagan Federation was founded in the early 70s, Earth Day had just started, and small Pagan Federation groups did celebrate Earth Day, and then we revived it in 1990. It sort of disappeared a bit. Revived it in 1990, and now on Earth Day, pagans will go out litter picking and all kinds of things, doing woodland work, but there'll often be a ceremony the night before for the people who are taking part, and the ceremony again will tune people's minds into what's to be done and ask blessings upon it. And very often these things are, of course, tied up with the cycle of the season. So Earth Day, 22nd of April, it's actually the eve of the Parilia, which was a Roman festival of the fields. Coincidentally, it wasn't chosen for that reason at all. And April, again, depending where you live, what your climate is like, April is a time to make things clear for the growth that's actually happening, to help the growth that's happening. So again, the festivals will go in with the practical work. Now, our festivals are very much tied in with the cycle of the seasons and what's around us, and the inner psychological sensation, the sense of self that goes along with that. So we're attuned to the larger whole.
Forgot to unmute myself for a second there. Thank you. Zarina, I was just thinking as well from what you were saying about how environmental consciousness becomes this vehicle for bringing people together and for rallying people around a sort of common cause. Do you think, or in your experience, has environmental consciousness been a kind of vehicle for interfaith dialogue as well as dialogue between secular communities and religious communities?
Yeah, I'm seeing more and more of that, which has been really great because it's a commonality. There is such a commonality about the responsibility of us human beings to look after the planet. being part of the one ecosystem, and looking after like resources and not exploiting the land that we live in. So it has brought in that ability for interfaith dialogues and also for intrafaith dialogues from different sects, and looking at how do we come together, work together, be together. And I think more so, obviously coming up towards COP26 with the conference coming up, it's been a great opportunity for communities to start thinking and planning together. So one of the things that I've just been involved is Faith Invest and Faith Plans, which is about looking at how can all people of all different faiths, well, institutes, when I say institutes, so like the religious institutes, come together to actually create their own faith plans to tackle climate change. And in this way, they're actually held accountable for their actions. So it's not just putting out a manifesto, it's not just putting out a declaration or not just putting out a statement, but it's actually to say, well, if you're a part of this faith plan, you know, you have a commitment to start doing things to tackle climate change. So which is brilliant, because this is a space where before I had never really seen many faith groups actually coming together. It was either you did something because you're a Christian, or you did something because you're a Muslim, or you did something because you're a Hindu, you know. But this has been, I think it's been a great opportunity to recognize the commonality, but also the strength of religious groups and the power that they hold is really important. And recognize that, you know, as a bigger, wider community, we actually could, and it gives us hope that we can make the changes that we need to make.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that faith communities have a huge voice when it comes to environmental action, and we hope that at COP that voice is going to be heard.
I mean, there is a caveat. Yeah. There is a caveat, because I still find, yes, over the last year, things have changed drastically. Right, but like I've been doing this work for over 10 years, and I still found that at different levels within a religious group. So when I talk about different levels, I talk about like the boards and committees, and then you've got like the priests, the pastors, the imams, the gurus. You've got that level, and then you've got the congregation, right? So at different levels, there's different conversations, and there's different interests. And there's different invested interests as well. So that's really important to recognize that as well. And there's still challenges among all the different levels.
Yeah, we're definitely not all singing from the same hymn sheet all the time. But yeah, no, it's really, there are big challenges as well. Prudence, I was just going to ask you sort of the same question. In your capacity as Interfaith Liaison Officer, have you found that your sort of understanding of our investment in nature and our unity with nature at this moment of kind of climate crisis, and where the climate emergency is so much at the forefront of our minds, has it been kind of a facilitated dialogue with the Pagan Federation and other groups?
I think the dialogue has been pretty much the same as it always is. It's just changed rather to environmental issues, which is absolutely marvelous. I mean, we've got people taking part in the vigils that are going on in various places, interfaith vigils. So there are pagan representatives there. These are for COP26. And we've taken part in interfaith discussions, again, at the Interfaith Network and elsewhere. So apart from the interfaith vigils, I'm not too aware of what other interfaith activities are going on at the moment to do with COP26. With pagans, it's more, I think, individual pagans and pagan groups going out and doing practical things and being on the boards of things like Pagan Aid and supporting Greenpeace and all the rest of it. I think we've been so actively involved for so long that I say I don't know too much about interfaith interfaith climate change activities that we're missing out on. I think we're already there. I hope.
Great.
If people want us to join, please get in touch. We'll be there like a shot.
That's great. Well, that actually leads to a question that we got from one of our members, which is, you know, how has the conversation around how best to protect the planet changed over time? Zarina, you were talking about the changes since you've been involved in environmentalism. What are some of the sort of most dramatic or drastic changes you've seen?
I suppose the biggest change is probably the change of language from climate change to climate emergency or a climate crisis. So that's probably been the biggest change in terms of getting policymakers to do things. But it also has that ripple effect on communities, because as soon as you start labeling something as an emergency or a crisis, people do stand up and start to listen and start to think. So I think that change has been really good to get, like, religious leaders to actually start to think, right, okay, we need to start doing something. We need to start having these conversations. We need to start taking action. So I think that's been a really positive thing. There's a lot of negativity around that, because they say, well, once you start putting something into like a climate crisis, you're creating anxiety, and there's like a terminology called climate anxiety now that's being thrown around. They're saying that where people are now in this place of climate anxiety where they are paralyzed into inaction as well. So it's always this like double-edged sword, do we use, like, what tactics do we use to make things work is really important. And then you've got like Extinction Rebellion that are doing the big movements and the demonstrations and the protests. But again, there's a caveat with that, because then it's exposed many people in society who can't get involved in direct activism because it has a negative impact on them. So for me, I suppose what's been happening is this wave of interest is happening, and people are coming into this wave at different levels, which is really good. Whether it's like through religion, through demonstrations, and through policymakers, but I think more and more people are normalizing having those conversations around climate change, which is really interesting. And also the media are not being so cynical about climate change, and are actually starting to think, well, hold it, we need to start thinking about the way we reference climate change as well. And then the other thing is, I suppose, is the climate finance side of it, like creating green jobs and greening everything. And there's a danger of greenwashing everything, which is what a lot of policymakers are doing. But at the same time, the greening is actually bringing people in that might not have been brought in previously.
Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, so I might just ask one last question to wrap up, which is really, through our Win Women project, we've been researching and celebrating, amazing inspirational women involved in the climate movement, Indigenous activists like Namontin and Chemo, oceanographers like Dr. Sylvia Earle. But we've also talked about the barriers facing women to involvement in this work. How do you think women are sort of uniquely placed, yes, to counter the crisis, but also how do we tackle these barriers that are in the way of our participation? Prudence, could I start with you?
Barriers. Well, I think a lot of women are tied up with domestic responsibilities, which make it difficult for them to respond to the kind of invitations that are offered to them. And I think that needs a much larger social change, a systemic change, if you like. So that's one of the reasons I suspect women are holding back. The other thing is just to know what you want to say and say it, and keep on saying it even when people interrupt. And I think women have got a lot better at speaking up, but there's social media, I think, have brought more pressure on young women to be pretty and pleasing and appealing and look nice. For heaven's sake, we got rid of that lot 60 years ago. Just be yourself, say what you have to say, and take part in arguments about it. That would be my advice.
And I think the other side of the coin with social media is also it actually can act as this disrupting influence where women from all over the world can be the part of the same conversation. So there's definitely two sides of the coin.
Everything has a dark side and a bright side. So let's celebrate the right side, yes.
Zarina, could I just ask you the same question quickly?
Yeah, and just to add on to what Prudence is in, I think we can also be our own worst enemies, so our own worst critics. So I think it's be kind to yourself, be kind to each other, but also if you're in a position where a door opens for you, don't shut that door behind you, keep it open and open it up for other people as well, for other women to, share that platform is what I would say.
What a great note to end on. So a massive thank you to our speakers, Prudence Jones, Zarina Ahmad, and Dr. Jagbir Jhutti-Johal for sharing your insights and perspectives at this critical juncture for climate action and environmentalism. And thank you to our members for sending in your questions. I think we're all agreed that it is past time to talk and act to protect our climate. And we celebrate the work of women in faith communities and environmental circles rising to these challenges, whether it's on the front lines or behind the scenes. In this moment of climate crisis, dialogue is no longer a buzzword really, but a crucial tool to ensure meaningful action. And each tradition we've heard from today will have an important mobilizing role in this process. However, we understand our responsibilities to our planet and thus to one another. The theologies discussed today call us to recognize our interconnectedness and in this way to move beyond labels like secular and religious, one faith tradition or another. When we sideline women's voices, as highlighted by our panelists, we sideline those who will carry the burden of climate change in many communities and whose perspectives are key to sustainable and effective solutions. So thank you for listening and please share widely to keep this conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.